1 year ago, 9 minutes and 29 seconds changed the nation. The lead starts right now. Memorials and marches planned nationwide the year after the murder of George Floyd. His killer, a former officer, headed to prison for Floyd's death. But what else has changed in that time? The House Republican leader finally condemns the, quote, appalling comments from Marjorie Taylor Greene comparing mask mandates to the Holocaust. If there was only someone with the power to take action against her for it. Plus, Donald Trump claims immunity in a lawsuit over the Capitol riot, saying he was just doing his job as president. Welcome to The Lead. I'm Pamela Brown in for Jake Tapper, and we begin with the national lead and the murder of a black man 1 year ago today that ignited a movement. This afternoon in Minneapolis, a moment of silence for George Floyd, killed by a police officer who kept Floyd pinned to the ground with his knee on Floyd's neck. The act amplified by a teenager's cell phone video and seen around the world. His death sparked protests, conversations about race, and debates over patterns and practices in policing. 1 year later, a more solemn tone with memorials, not just in the U.S., but also overseas. We saw demonstrations today in Britain. A crowd took a knee to remember Floyd in Scotland. And in Washington, D.C., the Floyd family discussed the need for police reform with members of Congress. And just moments ago, the Floyd family also came out to talk to reporters at the White House after meeting with President Biden. His daughter, Gianna, led what's become a rallying cry since her father's murder. Watch.
Say his name.
George Floyd.
We start this hour with the events today marking Floyd's death and efforts nationwide to keep up the momentum. CNN's Omar Jimenez has more from Minneapolis.
What do we want? Justice! What do we want? Now!
A year after George Floyd's murder was captured on camera over several agonizing minutes, America is still searching for change to last generations.
You seem good, you seem bad.
In Minneapolis, a day of celebrating the life and legacy of Floyd was mixed with somber reflection.
We are here, and it's been a year. It's been a troubling year, a long year, but we made it.
She and others later paused for a moment of silence. The mayor of Minneapolis joining in.
George Floyd is going to save the world. He's going to change the world. He's going to make sure that we look internally at ourselves, acknowledge our shortcomings, and make sure that we all do better from here.
It's not just in Minneapolis. Places across the country like Atlanta, Dallas, and more honoring the sobering anniversary. The symbolism is unquestionable. The long-term impact remains in question.
So my message to the president, get your people in order. So that is my reason of not being in D.C. today, and it's okay. Because I have no doubt in my mind that bill is going to get passed. And when it gets passed, that's when I'll make my way to D.C.
I think things have changed. I think that it's moving slowly, but it's making progress. I just want everything to be better in life because I don't want to see people dying the same way my brother has passed.
Minnesota State Representative John Thompson's friend, Philando Castile, was shot and killed by a Twin Cities police officer in 2016. That officer was found not guilty of manslaughter charges the following year. Thompson feels the pace of policy change hasn't kept up with reality.
Nothing's changed, just the names. And there'll be another name added to this long list of names until we get some real accountability pieces put into law here in this state. We could have saved George Floyd's life in 2016 when Philando was murdered. We could have saved Daunte Wright's life when George Floyd was murdered. Had we just looked at police accountability pieces seriously and said, we're going to put an end to this right now.
But others who have tried to work with police for reform say the momentum from the year that's passed could lead to a meaningful future.
What is different here in Minneapolis, and what is different in the fight that you all are trying to wage?
The difference now is that there's more awareness of the atrocities that the Minneapolis Police Department has been getting away with for decades. That's the difference.
Now, the community group that particular pastor represents says and tells us that his group has been reached out to by the Department of Justice's ongoing probe into patterns and practices at the Minneapolis Police Department. Meanwhile, downtown, the celebration of life for George Floyd continues with art, music, and speakers, some of who have been directly impacted by police violence. And of course, all of it comes as we expect a vigil later this evening at George Floyd Square. That's, of course, the intersection where he was murdered a year ago today. Pamela?
Okay, our thanks to Omar Jimenez. And turning now to the White House, where George Floyd's family just wrapped up their meeting with President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. CNN's Phil Mattingly joins me now. So, Phil, what do we know about the president's conversation with the family behind closed doors?
Yeah, Pamela, there's obviously a lot of focus in Washington right now about the policy, and that was certainly an element of the more than hour-long discussion the president and vice president had with 6 of George Floyd's family members. But it was also the personal as well. The president, according to 2 of George Floyd's brother, recognizing that this is obviously an anniversary of a death, and there was clearly loss there, and it's something the president focused on. Take a listen.
Genuine guy. They always speak from the heart, and it's a pleasure just to be able to have the chance to meet with him when we have that opportunity too. We're just thankful for what's going on.
Being here today is an honor, to meet with the president and the vice president, and for them to show their concern to our family, and for them to actually give an ear to our concerns.
And Pamela, the president has repeatedly referenced George Floyd's daughter, Gianna Floyd, on the campaign trail in White House events in the wake of meeting her a few days after George Floyd was murdered. And his family members said today that the president took some time to play with George Floyd's daughter inside the Oval Office, bringing a smile to her face. But as I noted, there's also a policy element here. The family is in town, is talking to lawmakers, not just the president, trying to urge forward police reform. And they acknowledge that the president said he was disappointed. The deadline of today has been missed by lawmakers. But in their words, the president wants the right bill, not a rushed bill. And Pamela should just note the president just put out a lengthy statement on the anniversary of George Floyd's death, and he kind of underscores there is still an urgency to get that bill to his desk as quickly as possible, saying, quote, last month's conviction of the police officer who murdered George was another important step forward toward justice, but our progress, Pamela, can't stop there.
All right, Phil Mattingly, live for us from the White House. Thanks so much, Phil. And I want to bring in our panel to further discuss this. Van Jones, I'm going to kick it off with you. First, after Floyd's murder 1 year ago today, we saw scores of people join protests calling for change. 1 year later, I'm curious what you think. How much momentum does the movement still have at this point?
Well, the President of the United States just spent an hour with a grieving family. Just think back in 2009, President Obama just mentioned that a police officer had acted poorly in arresting a famous black professor in his own home for no reason. And that the roof collapsed on him. That was the first time his poll numbers went below 50%. He couldn't even talk about the issue. So that's how far we've come. This movement is not going away. Any human system that does not have adequate checks and balances will have corruption and abuse. That's why we have meat inspectors, not because we hate butchers, but because somebody's got to be looking over the shoulder. That's why we have building inspectors, not because you hate construction workers. So the policing system is going to have to come into conformity with every other human system, and this movement is not going to stop until we have that outcome.
And Alfie, I want to get your views on this question. It wasn't just black people out there protesting. So many Americans, so many races saw the injustice, but you're not seeing that same overflow of activism and protesting now that you saw a year ago. Why do you think that is?
In a word, I would say racial battle fatigue. I think for those of us who are black specifically, we're tired. Just think about my day to day and how it occurred to me later in the day, in part why I'm so tired. And my sentiments about fatigue, I think, are probably echoed by Van, by you, by all kinds of folks in this world who are just frustrated and tired with the really slow pace progress. So to Van's point, we've seen progress, but we would like to see it go a lot faster. And that fatigue of dealing with racism is just too much. I learned this term the other day, racism-induced stress disorder. And I would say there's some part of that. And I think for other people of other races, they're probably frustrated because they care for Black people and they're tired as well. So it's just fatigue overall, emotional and physical.
Van, you'll recall in the wake of Floyd's death, scores of businesses vowed to change their own diversity and hiring practices. How do you think corporate America can still play a role here? What more should they be doing?
Well, the private sector made a bunch of comments. They posted a bunch of stuff on their websites. A lot of CEOs made statements, and their middle managers across the country were shocked to hear it because there was nothing planned to actually follow up. Some companies have done better than others. But the private sector has a tremendous opportunity here to go beyond just the statements that have been made on websites and to actually change hiring. And you're seeing real pressure now. It's not just a nice to do. You're seeing pressure from consumers that want to see brands match their money to their words. You're seeing pension funds and big investment pools of capital saying if you aren't doing right on race and gender and the environment, you can't get our money. So the private sector, I think, is going to be pushed forward to do more. We are in a moment of real awakening. You mentioned, people of all races marched and all races, a step forward. Even Dr. King never had a summer where 20 to 30 million people came out and marched with him. So you don't go back to doing nothing from that. We're in the middle of a process, both in the public and private sector, but the pressure is moving in one direction, that's forward.
And, Alfie, you had mentioned just the fatigue among Black Americans, calling out these injustices for decades. But if change is going to happen, this one group can't carry the mantle alone, as Van sort of pointed out there.
Absolutely, 100%. I think that it really is going to take, you think about when we talk about training people about cultural competence, when we teach people about things like critical race theory, even though we know that's a bad term for some people right now, when we teach people about diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. One of the key things that we talk about is it cannot just be the people who are oppressed. It can't just be Black people out here fighting because Black people don't own everything, right? So to Van's point about companies and corporations and organizations, most of those are not Black owned. And so it's going to take people in power. It's going to take what we call authentic allies to take up the fight, because sometimes people can't hear a Dr. Alfie or a Van Jones express these sentiments. Sometimes they need to hear somebody who looks like them. And so it's going to have to take a multiracial coalition of people globally for us to see change, real authentic change.
I'm just curious, Van, just going back to the point you made about Martin Luther King and now, what do you think is behind the change and the momentum that we are seeing? Why do you think people of other races in this country are sort of being more awakened to this issue and wanting to be more engaged with it? What's changed in your view?
Two things: technology and demography. I don't know if there's more or less police brutality or more or less police murder, but it's more visible than ever because of the cell phones and because of the camcorders that the police are bringing. So the dimmer switch is moving in one direction, making more and more visible what's going on. And then demography. I don't think people understand. You go to any kindergarten in America, you may as well be going to the United Nations. The younger generation is so diverse in America. Below 30 is so diverse in America. You don't have to be African American to have an African American friend or relative or lover or spouse or child. And so you have a big demographic receptivity to this. You have technology, and you also have people, frankly, just willing to speak out more. The Ava DuVernays and other people in the culture, the NBA players speaking out. And so you just have a bigger capacity to sustain this movement, which I've been a part of for 30 years. I've never seen it this big. And also I understand it's this big. It makes it more frustrating when we don't have the outcomes that we deserve from Congress. But we are going to prevail. This is not a movement that can be stopped. That there will be another video and another march. This system cannot stay the same. There has to be accountability.
All right, Van Jones, Alfie, Breland Noble, thank you both for that really important discussion.
My pleasure.
President Trump suddenly all about immunity, but not from COVID, while he claims he's not responsible at all for the Capitol insurrection. Plus, another ballot audit with much less insanity than the one going on in Arizona, now being